Hello, this is Brazos Minshew, the Chief Science Officer for Trivita, and I want to talk to you about a secret killer that could be lurking inside your body right now, and that killer is inflammation. Now in a moment I'm going to tell you the long trail of how we get chronic inflammation and how we can get rid of it, but before I get started, I realize that the first thing you say and the last thing you say is what people remember. So I want to start off by quoting one of our customers who had chronic inflammation and who took our product Nopalea, made from the nopal cactus, and this is what she said: "If inflammation is the problem, Nopalea is the solution." This is such a magnificent anti-inflammatory product that I know you're going to want to hear more about it. So let's begin. First of all, what is inflammation and how does it affect us? Well, the first thing to know about inflammation is that it's not always a bad thing. Inflammation may be a very good thing. For example, all of us have a temperature. We're all basically 98.6 degrees or 37 C if you're in Canada. We all have a temperature, and that means that something is keeping us warm. Something's burning inside of us, and that something is controlled, balanced inflammation. We need inflammation. It's how our immune system functions. However, some people experience imbalanced chronic inflammation, and this can be very, very bad for us. Here's how that works. Our body responds to any kind of outside invader with inflammation, whether that's a toxin, whether it's from an injury, an infection, an allergy, it doesn't matter. Anytime something is in our body that doesn't belong there, our body responds with focused inflammation. And this is where our immune system keeps us healthy. This is acute inflammation. On the other hand, if we're enduring chronic inflammation, constant chronic inflammation caused by toxicities, caused by injuries, caused by nutrient deficiencies or emotional distress, our health is going to be challenged. Chronic inflammation is our enemy because chronic inflammation turns healthy cells that we should have as our friends into unhealthy cells that now become our enemies. They become the focus for allergies and infection. They become the focus for disease. So chronic inflammation is bad, and acute inflammation is something that our body uses and can be very, very good. This kind of takes us into an illustration of inflammation. Think of it as fire. Think of it as a fire that's in your fireplace or in your cook stove. You can warm your food or warm your house with a properly controlled fire. Those are all good examples of good inflammation. Examples of bad, chronic inflammation may be when a little spark or ember comes out of that fireplace and lands on your carpet. That's very bad, because it can smolder there for minutes, hours, whatever. Eventually, it's going to catch fire and burn your house down, and that's a very bad thing. Chronic inflammation in your body is going to settle in what we call your weakest link. Remember, a chain is only as strong as the weakest link in the chain? We are only as healthy as our most vulnerable body system. These weak links, so to speak, are determined by our genetics, our environment, and by our lifestyle choices. They place us at various disease risks, weak links. So when a little spark of inflammation from a toxin or some other source gets into that weak link and creates chronic inflammation, later on that chronic inflammation becomes chronic disease, and we get very, very sick. Like those embers escaping the fireplace, chronic inflammation burns our house down. What are some of the problems associated with inflammation? Well, once upon a time, we only thought of diseases that ended with the suffix itis as inflammatory. So when we think of arthritis, tonsillitis, dermatitis, appendicitis, bronchitis, all of those conditions ending with itis, that's a way of signifying inflammation. In this case, it's acute inflammation that's actually part of the healing process. Because of toxins, injuries, nutrient deficiencies, and emotional distress, acute inflammation can become chronic and create disease. We don't like that because these are disabling, often life-ending diseases. In 2004, Time magazine published this extraordinary landmark article that said a whole host of chronic diseases are really based in a single phenomenon, chronic inflammation. Now imagine this. These are totally unconnected conditions that are now connected by a single thing, which is inflammation. Inflammation now connects things like arthritis, because that's an itis, it's an inflammatory disease, with an autoimmune disease like lupus. We never thought of autoimmune diseases as being particularly inflammatory until we start looking at its origins. Then we realize that this is just as inflammatory as any itis disease, perhaps even more so. And neurological diseases, everything from migraine headaches to Parkinson's, are now linked by inflammation as well. Pulmonary diseases like asthma and allergies are also chronic inflammatory conditions. Another interesting form of inflammation happens when cardiovascular disease that leads to heart attack and stroke. What's interesting for us is that we get these miniature cholesterol grease fires burning in our blood vessels, and your body puts them out with foam cells. I mean, you can't put water on a grease fire, right? It just spreads. And so your body puts foam cells in this region to put the fire out. Unfortunately, besides putting out the fire, the foam cells also become hardened. They harden and become plaque inside the arteries and eventually become the epicenter for a clot to form, causing a heart attack or a stroke. Now we get to one of the most feared inflammatory diseases, which is Alzheimer's disease. And we always say that Alzheimer's occurs when beta-amyloid plaques accumulate in the brain and the neurofibrillary tangles accumulate in the brain. But we find healthy people that have both plaques and tangles and don't have Alzheimer's disease. What's the difference? Well, there's a thin layer of immune cells in the brain called glial cells. And when these become inflamed as part of an immune system reaction, when the glial cells become inflamed, that's what creates Alzheimer's disease. Or it's like Professor Robert Roundtree, a professor of neurology, once said, inflammation melts your brain. Now, what we know from our experience